yes, we are at war. Very definitely, we have been at war. It's an economic war, it's a war of subversion, it's a war of espionage, it's a war of ideas, and it's a war of terrorism and infiltration.
America is the prize for the terrorist. America is indeed the target for the radicals, the leftists, and the communists.
A few years ago, most of us thought that terrorism was something that existed in other countries. It could never happen here. But recent events have shown that now our public figures are routinely the targets of kidnapping and assassination attempts. And any citizen suddenly could become a hostage, be blown apart by a hidden bomb, or killed by sniper fire in the street. Terrorism is no longer limited to a band of fanatics in the Middle East, Africa, or Europe. We ourselves now are the target, and there is no place to hide. In Israel, terrorists from the Palestine Liberation Organization seize a school and hold 95 children as hostages. When their demands are not granted, they turn machine guns on the children and set off hand grenades in their midst. 28 are killed and more than 70 wounded. In Ireland, a 100-pound bomb goes off in downtown Belfast, killing 9. Within the hour, 20 more bombs explode throughout the city. On other occasions, fireballs of plastic explosives are hurled into pubs, leaving behind a carpet of charred bodies. In Spain, Prime Minister Luis Carrero is killed in an explosion with such force that it blows his car over the top of a church. Credit for the act is claimed by a separatist group called the Basque Nation and Liberty. In New York, a tavern is bombed by a Puerto Rican terrorist group, the FALN. 57 people are killed or injured. The Black Liberation Army attacks a police station in San Francisco, and in New York sets up a series of ambushes for police. 2 officers are killed. Members of the Weather Underground plant bombs in the U.S. Capitol building, the U.S. Senate building, and at the Pentagon. As a joint operation, the Black Liberation Army and the Weather Underground carry out a series of armored truck robberies in New York, which yields hundreds of thousands of dollars for future operations and results in the deaths of policemen and security guards. The chronicle of terrorism is lengthy and ongoing, with thousands of new assaults added to the world record each year. The sheer quantity of these events tends to numb the public consciousness and to obscure any real understanding of why they happen. The more we see, the less we know. But if we step back from the details, we find that several overall patterns emerge. Patterns that are more enlightening than the events themselves. The first pattern that becomes apparent is the fact that most terrorist groups today are not isolated from each other, but are in fact so closely intertwined that they constitute an international network. This was first documented in 1976 by European intelligence specialist Pierre de Villemarais in a 4-volume study published in France entitled The Secret History of Terrorist Organizations. In 1981, it also became the subject of a book by Claire Sterling entitled The Terror Network, published by Reader's Digest Press in the United States. The reality of this network is evidenced by the fact that not only do the groups assist each other, but they even carry out attacks on behalf of other organizations. For example, in 1972, at the Lod Airport in Tel Aviv, Israel, terrorists with automatic rifles and hand grenades attack passengers in a crowded waiting room. Over 100 people are killed or wounded. This is not done by the PLO, but by members of the Japanese Red Army on behalf of the Palestinian terrorists. The OPEC headquarters in Vienna is seized. 3 men are killed and 11 oil ministers are taken hostage. The raid is a joint operation of 2 organizations, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the German Red Army Fraction. The interlocking nature of the terrorist network is the outgrowth of the fact that leaders of most of these groups, regardless of their origin, receive their training, their indoctrination, and their weapons from the same source.
Sometimes the Soviets will support individual terrorist groups directly, as they have been doing in South Africa for the past 10 years, where the terrorist organization, the African National Congress, could not possibly exist without direct and massive Soviet aid. Sometimes they provide support for terrorist groups through surrogate countries, and in particular Cuba and Libya.
Mr. John Reese is the publisher of Information Digest, an internationally circulated intelligence report dealing with terrorism and internal security.
Sometimes this will be done by them directly through the KGB, their secret police. Other times it's done through a group badly misnamed called the World Peace Council. And I can remember a couple of years ago talking to a high-level Soviet defector called Igor Glagolev, who had attended World Peace Council meetings, which in turn had had men from what was then Rhodesia present, and they had used the World Peace Council as the cover and the venue to discuss what weapons they needed the Soviet Union to provide them with. That is how Robert Mugabe got the guns and the rockets and the ammunition that was able to take over Rhodesia and turn it into the sad country of Zimbabwe.
The leadership of the Soviet Union has steadfastly advocated a program of encouraging and supporting revolutions in non-communist countries. By the early 1960s, special training centers had been established at the Lenin Institute and the Patrice Lumumba University, both in Moscow, and also one at Simferopol in the Crimea. Additional centers were set up in Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria, and North Korea. Recruits from all over the world received intensive instruction in the use of light weapons, explosives, guerrilla warfare, and propaganda. By the mid-1960s, Cuba had been added to the list of terrorist training centers, and in January of 1966 was the host to an international meeting held there called the Tricontinental Conference. It was attended by over 500 representatives of 83 terrorist groups. The purpose of the meeting was to establish strategy and channels of communication for instigating civil war within the non-communist nations on the tricontinents of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. This operation was placed under the supervision of Cuban intelligence, called the DGI. Cuba has trained and supplied literally thousands of terrorists from scores of countries in Africa and South America, particularly the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the Tupamaros in Uruguay, and the FMLN in El Salvador. In fact, the Salvadoran terrorists were given American weapons and military equipment that had been abandoned to Hanoi after the Vietnam War. The material was first shipped to Cuba and then sent to Nicaragua, where the Sandinistas smuggled it into El Salvador.
They thought I was a demolitions expert, and I never led them to believe otherwise. As a kid growing up, my grandmother...
Larry Grathwohl became a member of the Weather Underground organization as an undercover operative for law enforcement agencies in Cincinnati. His role within the organization was to carry directives from the Central Committee to the operating units in the field.
If you lit it or whatever, but they had no experience at all, which was a tremendous advantage to me. Most of the people that had no prior experience, let's say the average weatherman, if there is such a thing, they sent to Cuba for training in Cuba. When the Venceremos brigades were first being organized, I had a part in that. Myself and a guy named Robert Burlingham were assigned the responsibility for organizing the 1st and the 2nd Venceremos Brigade in Ohio. I was told at that time that the only reason that the Venceremos Brigade existed was so that the weathermen could send people, and other terrorist organizations in the United States could send people to Cuba for training. Also, Tricontinental played a significant role in Weatherman activities. The leadership was in constant contact with Tricontinental, and that particular organization is funded by the DGI. I was told after my experience with the Weathermen that many of the people sent to Cuba on the Venceremos brigades were approached by agents of the DGI. And I also know that the DGI is controlled by the KGB.
As the Soviet connection with international terrorism became increasingly obvious, the KGB made a tactical decision to establish training centers in countries that generally are not regarded as communist. In this way, the Soviets could disclaim responsibility. An example is Libya, under the dictatorship of Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi's army and air force are almost entirely supplied by the Soviet Union. Altogether, there are 5,000 military personnel from the Eastern Communist bloc and from Cuba. Libya received $2.5 billion worth of arms from the Soviets between 1974 and 1981, an amount far in excess of its own internal needs. Many of these arms have moved through Libya and into the terrorist network. The Provisional IRA in Ireland has been receiving weapons from Libya at the rate of millions of dollars per year. The Irish revolutionaries received their first Russian rocket launchers as early as 1972. Gaddafi has maintained 3 separate training camps, which are staffed by personnel from the Soviet Union and East Germany. He has provided instructions, money, or weapons to practically every terrorist group in the world. He has been one of the primary financial sponsors of the PLO, and he openly has called for the death of any Arab leader who is friendly to the United States. Angola is another country that, although not officially a Soviet satellite, nevertheless is a communist outpost in Africa. In September of 1981, South African troops made a surprise sweep 60 miles into Angola to destroy a guerrilla training base from which terrorists had been conducting operations. It was a highly productive raid which cleared away any doubt about communist involvement in African terrorism. Killed in the fighting were 2 Soviet military officers, and a Soviet sergeant major was taken prisoner. Also taken were 50 Soviet tanks and armored vehicles, and over 2,000 tons of ammunition, rifles, rocket launchers, anti-aircraft guns, and landmines. It is now known that in southern Africa alone, there are 3,800 Soviet and East German military personnel, and from Cuba, more than 28,000 soldiers. By the end of the 1970s, the KGB had succeeded in establishing terrorist support centers like these, not only in Libya and Angola, but also in Algeria, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, South Yemen, and Mozambique. The problem of moving terrorists from one country to another without detection by the authorities has become the specialty of an organization headquartered in Paris called the Curiel apparatus. Henri Curiel was an Egyptian communist who had been expelled from Egypt by King Farouk. He went to France, where he established an underground railroad for draft dodgers and deserters, and later, during the Algerian War, for terrorists of the FLN. The internationally recognized authority on the Curiel apparatus is French author and journalist Roland Gaucher, who has written widely on the subject of the Communist Party in France, and in particular, the Curiel connection.
Ils ont un rôle qui est très important dans toute armée, qui est celui d'une logistique.
It has a very important role called logistics in the army. And Curiel's Underground Railroad truly serves that function. Of what does it consist? A number of activities that I shall enumerate. For international terrorists who pass through France, this group provides shelter and means of communication which permits them to be completely independent and out of reach of the police.